In the quiet city of Misato, Japan, 17-year-old Junko Furuta seemed to have a bright future ahead. She was popular, kind, a good student, and had a loving family. In November 1988, she was saving money for a graduation trip and had a job lined up. Her whole life lay before her. But on the night of November 25, 1988, as she headed home from work, 4 boys from her school targeted her. What followed became known as the worst case of juvenile delinquency in Japan's post-war history. This is the story of 44 days of unimaginable torture, failed police responses, and a justice system that many believe completely failed the victim. On the evening of November 25, 1988, in Misato, Saitama, it was likely cold, a typical late autumn night in Japan. For Junko Furuta, it marked the end of a regular day. She had just finished her shift at a plastic molding factory, a job she started only a month earlier. She was saving every yen for a graduation trip, a last adventure with her friends before entering adulthood. She was well-liked, the kind of teenager parents hold up as an example. As she hopped on her bicycle and began pedaling home, she had no reason to suspect that this routine ride would be her last as a free person. The route was familiar, and the streets were quiet. But in the shadows of a local park, 2 individuals lay in wait. They weren't just loitering, they were hunting. Hiroshi Miyano, 18, and Shinji Minato, 16, were seeking a victim. They had a history of violence and were experienced in targeting women. Miyano, in particular, was a known school bully who instilled fear by bragging about his connections to the Yakuza. He had developed a crush on Junko, and she had politely but firmly turned him down. For Miyano, this was an unforgivable insult. He rarely heard no, and when he did, he reacted not with sadness but with deep, vengeful anger. As she rode her bike, Junko entered their line of sight. It was around 8:30 p.m. Their plan was now in motion. It was a calculated and cruel trick to create a false sense of security. Minato made the first move. He rushed forward and kicked Junko off her bicycle, causing her to crash to the ground. The impact was sudden and violent. Before she could even process it, Minato fled the scene, leaving her stunned, hurt, and confused on the dark path. Then, as planned, Hiroshi Miyano appeared. He played his role perfectly, helping the disoriented girl to her feet. He feigned concern, asking if she was okay and pretending to have witnessed the unprovoked attack. He positioned himself as her protector, her safe passage in a suddenly dangerous world. He offered to walk her home. For Junko, still in shock and fear, his offer must have felt like a lifeline. Trusting this seemingly kind stranger was a natural human response. She agreed. With that agreement, she willingly walked straight into a trap with no escape. Miyano did not lead her toward the safety of her family home. Instead, he directed her away from the main roads to an isolated location, an abandoned warehouse. The walk to the warehouse was likely filled with tense silence or deceptive small talk for Miyano, while Junko's heart raced with gratitude and fear from the initial attack. Upon reaching the warehouse, the mask came off completely. Inside that cold, empty space, Miyano revealed who he was. He reminded her of his Yakuza connections and threatened her. If she screamed, fought back, or told anyone, he would use his gang ties to locate and murder her entire family. For a 17-year-old girl, the thought of being responsible for her parents' and brothers' deaths must have been more terrifying than any immediate harm to herself. This threat became the psychological cage that restrained her long before any physical prison did. In this warehouse, Miyano raped her for the first time. After the assault, he didn't let her go. He called Shinji Minato at home, speaking to another member of their group, 17-year-old Joe Ogura. Miyano boasted about what he had just done. Ogura's response was crucial. He told Miyano not to release her. This was no longer a single assault. It became a group project. Mayano then moved Junko from the warehouse to a park in Adachi, Tokyo. In the park, the other boys, Ogura, Minato, and a fourth teen, 17-year-old Yasushi Watanabe, were waiting. The balance of power was now overwhelmingly against her. They all gang-raped her there. The final step was to find a permanent place to hold her. Shinji Minato provided the solution. He suggested taking her to his parents' house. And so, they smuggled Junko Furuta into a seemingly ordinary home, into a second-floor room where the unimaginable began. The room in the Minato house wasn't a basement dungeon or a soundproofed cell. It was a regular second-floor room in a typical family home in Adachi, Tokyo. For the first few days, the boys maintained a fragile act for Shinji Minato's parents. When the parents were home, Junko was forced to pretend she was Hiroshi Mayano's girlfriend. They told her to act as if her presence was voluntary, a consensual visit. She had to behave normally, smile, and engage in small talk. The parents, however, were not completely fooled. They saw a young girl who was always there. They noticed she never seemed to leave. They saw bruises on her face and body. The boy's story, that she was a willing girlfriend, began to break down. At one point, the act collapsed completely. In a rare moment when she might have been alone with Minato's mother, Junko looked at her and directly begged for help. She pleaded to be saved. It clearly signaled that something was terribly wrong. The mother knew. The father likely knew. But they did nothing. Their inaction would become a central part of the tragedy. Later, they would claim they feared their own son and his friends, and were terrified by the repeated threats of Yakuza retaliation. Whether out of fear, willful ignorance, or a lack of moral courage, the adults in the house chose to look away. Their silence gave the boys permission to escalate their brutality, knowing no one would intervene. As the illusion of normalcy shattered for the parents, the violence in the upstairs room quickly intensified. The four main perpetrators, Mayano, Minato, Ogura, and Watanabe, soon began inviting their friends and acquaintances to join in. Over the 44 days, more than 100 different boys and young men came to that house and participated in the rape of Junko Furuta. The boys, fueled by alcohol, a sense of impunity, and deep-seated cruelty, started devising new forms of torture. The assaults became intertwined with unimaginable physical violence. They inserted objects into her body: bottles, scissors, skewers, and iron bars. They lit matches and put them inside her. They forced a light bulb into her vagina and turned it on, causing severe internal burns and damage. They shaved her pubic hair with a razor and then burned the raw skin with a lighter. They placed fireworks in her ears and mouth and set them off, permanently damaging her eardrums and making it hard for her to hear. The beatings were a daily occurrence. They used whatever was at hand: golf clubs, bamboo sticks, metal rods. They treated her like a human punching bag, taking turns hitting her for fun. They even hung her from the ceiling and used her as a piñata. As the weeks turned into December, Junko's body began to visibly break down. The constant beatings caused her face to swell into an unrecognizable mask. Her features were distorted by bruises and cuts. Her injuries to her legs and feet became so severe that she could no longer walk. She was confined to the floor of the room. Unable to use the bathroom downstairs, she was forced to urinate and defecate where she lay. This led to infected wounds, and a foul, rotting smell began to fill the room. The boys, who had caused this very state, now found her disgusting. Their sexual assaults decreased because they were repulsed by the physical condition they had created. In response, the physical beatings only increased. They burned her eyelids and genitals with cigarettes and hot wax. They used pliers to twist off one of her nipples. They forced her to masturbate in front of them for their amusement. They made her dance naked while they laughed. They deprived her of food, feeding her only tiny amounts, and eventually restricting her to a diet of only milk. They forced her to drink her own urine and eat live cockroaches. She attempted escape at least once, which led to an even more severe punishment. But as the torture reached its peak in late December, her pleas began to change. She was no longer begging for freedom. She was begging for death. She asked them to kill her, to end her suffering. The ordinary house in Adachi had become a factory of pain, and Junko Furuta was its sole, broken product. The parents downstairs continued their daily lives, choosing to ignore the sounds from above, the smell, the constant stream of strange boys coming and going. The prolonged nature of Junko Furuta's ordeal is what makes it so particularly agonizing to examine. This was not a crime that was over in a few hours. It spanned 44 days. And during that time, there were multiple concrete moments where the entire nightmare could have been stopped. The first and most obvious failure was that of the adults who lived in the house. But the failures extended far beyond that one household. The official systems of society also broke down. The first direct encounter with the police occurred because of a visitor. One of the many boys who had been invited to the house to assault Junko was reportedly so disturbed by what he witnessed that he went home and told his older brother. This brother, recognizing the severity of the situation, immediately told their parents. Those parents, to their credit, did the right thing. They contacted the police. Police officers were dispatched to the Minato residence, but what happened next was a catastrophic failure of procedure. The officers did not insist on searching the house. They did not demand to see the girl. They did not separate the family members and question them individually. Instead, they spoke to whoever answered the door, likely one of the parents or one of the perpetrators, and accepted their assurance that no girl was being held against her will. There was no second visit, no further investigation. The chance to save Junko was lost because of a lack of diligence and a willingness to accept the easiest answer. The second police failure was even more devastating because it originated from Junko herself. In a testament to her incredible courage and enduring will to live, she managed to find a moment alone and get to a telephone. She dialed the police. Her heart must have been pounding, believing that rescue was finally at hand. But before she could speak, before she could utter a single word of explanation, the boys discovered her. They realized what she was doing, and one of them took the phone from her hand. He then spoke to the police operator on the other end of the line. He calmly told the operator that the call had been a mistake, a misdial. And the operator, and the system behind that operator, accepted this. No callback was attempted. No unit was dispatched to check on the address from which the call originated. The authorities had been at the doorstep and on the phone, and both times they had turned away. The tragedy of Junko Furuta is not only the evil inflicted by 4 teenagers, but also the passive enabling by those who saw, who heard, and who had the power to act, but chose not to. This systemic failure meant that Junko's fate was sealed long before her physical death. It meant that her torture was allowed to continue to its brutal, inevitable conclusion, unimpeded by the very structures designed to prevent such atrocities. By the first days of January 1989, the room in the Minato house was no longer a place of temporary captivity. It had become a death chamber. Junko Furuta was, by all accounts, barely alive. Her body had been pushed far beyond its limits. The final catalyst for her murder was not a grand plan, but something trivial and infuriatingly mundane. On the night of January 3rd, Hiroshi Miyano had been playing mahjong, a popular tile-based game, and had lost a significant amount of money. The loss enraged him. His anger, as always, demanded an immediate outlet. That outlet was the broken body of Junko Furuta. On the morning of January 4th, he descended into the room where she lay, his fury looking for a target. What followed was a final, sustained assault that lasted for approximately 2 hours. The violence was methodical and increasingly savage. He began by dripping hot candle wax onto her face, scalding her skin. He then placed shortened candles directly on her eyelids, allowing the burning wax to sear her most delicate skin. He forced her to drink her own urine, a final act of humiliation. He then lifted her and kicked her, causing her to fall against a stereo unit. This impact seemed to trigger a catastrophic physical failure, and Junko began to have violent convulsions. They saw her seizures as a performance. To prevent their hands from getting bloody, they covered them with plastic bags. Then, they continued the beating. They punched and kicked her prone, convulsing body. Mayano then produced an iron barbell, a piece of exercise equipment, and began beating her with it. He also repeatedly dropped the heavy weight onto her abdomen. The internal damage from this alone would have been fatal. But Mayano was not finished. He poured a large amount of lighter fluid directly onto her legs, arms, face, and stomach. He then set her on fire. Eyewitness statements from the other boys describe Junko, in a last reflexive act of a body fighting to survive, weakly trying to pat out the flames with her hands. The fire burned, and she gradually stopped moving. She slipped into unconsciousness and died a few hours later. Her suffering, at long last, was over. The silence that followed in that room was the silence of a crime completed. The only thing left was the disposal of the evidence. The immediate hours following Junko Furuta's death were not filled with panic or remorse, but with a cold, practical focus on concealment. The boys knew they had crossed a final, irreversible line. Their primary emotion was likely fear of being caught, not grief for the life they had extinguished. For nearly 24 hours, they left her body in the room, perhaps unsure of what to do or waiting for cover of darkness. It was Shinji Minato's brother who, upon seeing her, confirmed that she was dead. This spurred them into action. Their solution was as brutal and impersonal as the torture that had preceded it. They wrapped her lifeless body in the blankets she had been lying on, attempting to contain the smell and the evidence. They then stuffed her into a large travel bag, the kind used for major trips. The next step was to make her disappear permanently. They acquired a 44-gallon drum, an industrial container. They placed the travel bag with Junko's body inside it. Then, they mixed and poured wet concrete into the drum, encasing her completely. They loaded the drum into a car and drove to a vacant lot on Wakasu, a man-made island in Tokyo Bay often used for industrial storage and construction. Under the cover of night, they dumped the drum, leaving it among other debris, believing they had successfully hidden their crime. Meanwhile, in the real world, the Furuta family was living in an agonizing limbo. Their daughter was still officially a missing person. They had no body to mourn, no closure. The police investigation had stalled after the initial, misleading phone call Junko had been forced to make. The boys, emboldened by their success in hiding the murder, continued their lives. In fact, their confidence was so high that they had already committed another horrific crime during Junko's captivity. In December, unsatisfied with being unable to rape Junko due to her deteriorating condition, they had abducted and gang-raped another 19-year-old woman. It was this crime, not Junko's murder, that first brought them to the attention of the authorities. In January 1989, Hiroshi Mayano and Joe Ogura were arrested for this separate kidnapping and gang rape. They were in police custody for this offense, being questioned about a different victim, while Junko's body remained undiscovered in its concrete tomb. The disposal of Junko's body was, for a time, successful. It created a silence that lasted for almost 2 months, a silence that allowed the perpetrators to believe they had gotten away with murder. For nearly 2 months, the concrete drum containing Junko Furuta's body sat undiscovered on the vacant lot in Tokyo. The investigation into her disappearance had grown cold, stymied by the dead end of her forced phone call to her parents. The break in the case came from an entirely different direction, through a mistake born of arrogance and fear. In January 1989, Hiroshi Miyano and Joe Ogura had been arrested for the gang rape of the other 19-year-old woman they had kidnapped in December. They were in police custody, being held and questioned specifically about that crime. The police were focused on building a case for this abduction and rape. During the interrogation process, officers went to search addresses connected to the suspects. At one location, they discovered women's underwear. This was a piece of physical evidence that suggested broader, perhaps more numerous, criminal activities than the single rape they were investigating. The critical moment occurred when an officer questioning Miyano showed him the underwear and asked him about it. The context of the question was about the December rape case. But Miyano's mind went elsewhere. Sitting in the interrogation room, separated from his accomplices, he began to panic. He assumed that his accomplice, Joe Ogura, had already broken under pressure. He believed that Ogura had not only confessed to the rape they were being questioned about, but had also told the police everything about Junko Furuta, the kidnapping, the 44 days of torture, and the murder. This misinterpretation was the crack that shattered the entire wall of silence. Deciding that full cooperation was his only way to get a lighter sentence, Miyano began to talk. He started confessing to a murder the police didn't even know had happened. Miyano was talking about a body, about concrete, about a drum on a vacant lot. The police were trying to connect this to the case of the missing woman and her 7-year-old son from an unrelated, unsolved murder that had occurred just 9 days before Junko's abduction. They were puzzled, trying to fit Miyano's detailed account into the framework of a different investigation. It took time for the horrifying truth to dawn on them. Miyano was describing a completely separate, unknown homicide. Once they realized this, the investigation shifted with explosive speed. On March 30, 1989, acting on the directions Miyano had provided, police went to the vacant lot on Wakasu Island. There, they found the gallon drum. It was heavy, filled with solid concrete. Using specialized tools, they carefully broke open the concrete casing. Inside, they found the travel bag. And inside the bag, they discovered the badly decomposed remains of a young woman. The body was so damaged that identification through visual recognition was impossible. They resorted to fingerprint analysis. Junko Furuta's fingerprints were on file from her part-time job. A match was made. The girl who had been missing for over 4 months was finally found. Her family's worst fears were confirmed. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department and, soon, the entire nation. The arrest of Shinji Minato, Yasushi Watanabe, and Minato's brother quickly followed. The public demand for severe punishment was overwhelming. There were calls for the death penalty, and calls for life imprisonment. The 4 main perpetrators, Hiroshi Miyano, Shinji Minato, Joe Ogura, and Yasushi Watanabe, were now facing justice. However, the Japanese legal system had a significant complicating factor. All 4 were legally considered juveniles. Under Japanese law in 1989, anyone under the age of 20 was a minor in the eyes of the court. This designation meant their identities were to be sealed from the public to protect their privacy and facilitate rehabilitation. It also meant they would be sentenced under juvenile guidelines, which prioritized correctional education over pure punishment, even for the most heinous crimes. The court proceedings began under a cloud of intense public scrutiny. The perpetrators were referred to in official documents only as A. Miyano, B. Ogura, C. Minato, and D. Watanabe. This attempt at anonymity was almost immediately challenged by the press. Journalists from the weekly magazine Shuken Bunshun investigated and successfully uncovered their full names. They argued, and much of the public agreed, that the sheer brutality of the crime forfeited their right to anonymity. The trial itself was a tense affair. The prosecution laid out the overwhelming evidence: the confession, the discovered body, and the testimony of other youths who had visited the house. The defense attorneys likely focused on the defendants' youth, their potential for reform, and the influence of gang culture. They presented mitigating circumstances, such as the fact that Mayano's parents had sold their family home to pay 50 million yen, about $350,000 at the time, in compensation to the Furuta family, a sum the defense argued showed remorse. In July 1990, the Tokyo District Court found all four guilty of a litany of charges including abduction, confinement, rape, assault, murder, and abandonment of a corpse. But the sentences felt shockingly light to a public demanding retribution. Hiroshi Mayano, the 18-year-old ringleader, was given a 17-year prison term. The public outcry was so fierce that all four defendants appealed their sentences, a move that backfired spectacularly. In July 1991, the Tokyo High Court resentenced them, actually increasing their terms. Mayano's sentence was extended to 20 years. Shinji Minato, who had provided the location for the torture, saw his sentence increased to a range of 5 to 9 years. Joe Ogura was resentenced to 5 to 10 years, and Yasushi Watanabe was sentenced to 5 to 7 years. While the increases were a response to public pressure, they still fell far short of the life sentences many had sought. The legal justification for these sentences was rooted in precedent and the Nagayama Standard, the guidelines Japanese courts use for considering the death penalty. That standard, established after a series of juvenile murders in the 1960s, rarely applies the death penalty in cases with a single victim. Furthermore, legal experts noted that while the torture was prolonged, the final intent to murder was argued by the defense as being uncertain until the last day, a distinction that separated it from cases of clear, premeditated murder. To the Furuta family and the Japanese public, however, these legal nuances were an insult. The sentences were widely perceived as a profound failure of justice. The fact that the perpetrators could one day walk free, that their youth was considered a mitigating factor for such extreme evil, sent a chilling message about the value of a victim's life. The light punishments were also widely believed to be connected to the boys' alleged Yakuza ties, fostering a perception that organized crime could influence the courts. The trial did not bring closure. It cemented a feeling of injustice that would become a permanent part of Junko Furuta's story. The system had failed her in life by not saving her, and it failed her in death by delivering what many saw as a slap on the wrist to her killers. The release of the four perpetrators from prison did not bring an end to the Junko Furuta case. It simply opened a new, deeply troubling chapter. The central question hanging over the light sentences had always been one of rehabilitation. The first to be released was Yasushi Watanabe, who served his 5 to 7 year sentence and was freed in 1996. He returned to live with his mother in Tokyo. Public information about his life is scarce, but it is known that by 2005, he had developed a degenerative neurological disease. Lacking the financial means to afford proper treatment, his health deteriorated. He died in May 2021 at the age of 49. Shinji Minato, whose family home was the scene of the crime, was released in 1998 after serving his sentence. Joe Ogura's path after release was perhaps the most brazen. He served 8 years in a juvenile prison and was released in 1999. In an attempt to escape his past, he was adopted by a supporter and changed his surname to Kamasaku. In July 2022, at the age of 51, he died in a bizarre accident. While under the influence of psychiatric medication, he collapsed, got his head stuck between his toilet bowl and tank, and choked to death on his own vomit. His death, like his life, was marked by squalor and violence. Hiroshi Mayano, the ringleader, was released in 2009 after serving his 20-year sentence. He changed his name to Hiroshi Yokoyama. The post-release lives of these four men stand as a stark indictment of the Japanese juvenile justice system in this case. The goal of rehabilitation was an abject failure. none of them became peaceful citizens. Instead, they demonstrated a lifelong pattern of violence, criminality, and an utter lack of remorse. For the Furuta family and for the public, the aftermath of the case was a continuous, painful reminder that the injustice of the sentencing was compounded by the system's inability to enact any meaningful change in the perpetrators. The case became a benchmark for brutality, a name that every Japanese citizen recognizes. While it did not lead to immediate, sweeping legal reforms, it irrevocably changed the conversation about crime and punishment. Junko Furuta's story endures not because of the unspeakable cruelty inflicted upon her, but because of the vibrant, normal life she represented. Her legacy is one of a bright future extinguished, a stark warning against indifference, and a permanent symbol of the fight for victims' rights. The final chapter of her story is written in the ongoing refusal to let her be forgotten, a collective vow that her suffering must have meaning, and a hope, however fragile, that such a tragedy will never, ever be repeated. And that's all we have for today's episode. I want to thank you all for being here. I truly appreciate your support to this channel. I will be seeing you soon on our next episode. Goodbye.